My stepmom clinked her wine glass, smiled at 50 guests packed into the country club ballroom, and announced that I was just support staff 3 hours after the Pentagon asked me to brief a classified mission. Her voice carried across the chandeliers and polished white tablecloths as if she were delivering a toast meant to save the world. Instead, she saved her cruelty for me. It was the night of my father Daniel Archer's 60th birthday in October 2024, Charlotte, North Carolina, a night Cheryl had planned down to the color of the napkins and the angle of every photo backdrop. She extended her manicured hand toward her son Tyler, pulling him closer, like he was the golden child. Then she looked at me, standing at the back of the room holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres she had ordered me to help pass out, and she let out a laugh that cut sharper than any blade. Sloan works in the Army, but don't get excited. She just does support paperwork so real soldiers can work. The guests burst into laughter. One woman nudged her husband and whispered loudly enough for me to hear, "That means she's like a government secretary, right?" Someone else added, "At least she's safe, not like the real ones out there." My father lifted his wine glass and actually nodded as if the joke were clever. "She's always been good at organizing things." That sentence stung more than any shrapnel I've ever seen. I froze in place, the tray heavy in my hands, the room spinning with the sound of my own humiliation. But none of them knew the truth. Behind my quiet posture and my bland dress and my barely touched makeup was the identity they had never bothered to learn. I am Captain Sloan Archer, 28 years old, Army Special Operations Intelligence Officer, call sign Valkyrie. The same name whispered through SOCOM briefings after the Sahel hostage extraction, the same name that made a colonel once say, "We move when Valkyrie says we move." But in my father's ballroom with gold ribbons wrapped around the chairs, I was whatever Cheryl needed me to be so she could tower over me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a coded notification from my unit confirming wheels down for a brief Charlotte area visit. I inhaled slowly, pretending it was nothing more than a social text. Cheryl walked toward me holding a small gift box with my name on it, dangling from her fingers, as if it were contaminated. She tapped it with her nail, probably another Army mug, right? They love their mugs. Then she placed the box on the end of a dessert table, refusing to open it in front of anyone, because she wanted to keep the joke alive. One uncle stepped closer and asked, "Do you ever see combat?" Before I could answer, Cheryl cut in, smiling bright enough to blind. Combat. God, no. She would faint. She sits behind screens. The room laughed again, as if they were in on some script written long before I arrived. I swallowed hard. Last month, I watched a village freed because I changed a route 7 minutes before the team moved. But you're support staff. My father caught my eye for a split second and he looked away, pretending to be engrossed in conversation with a man he barely knew. I wondered how many times I had given him chances to see me and how many times he had chosen not to. My chest tightened. Memories flickered. The first time I wore a JROTC uniform, the way Cheryl had rolled her eyes. The time I told her I wanted to join the Army and she said girls like you join nothing important. The night she had shoved my mother's keepsakes into a storage box because we need a fresh start. And now here, I was supposed to serve food at my own father's birthday while she erased me again. My palms tingled with the urge to defend myself, but years in the military had taught me discipline. You don't fight battles on the wrong terrain. You wait. You choose the ground. You strike when the time is right. Cheryl lifted her glass again to introduce Tyler for his speech when the light through the front windows shifted. I caught the reflection first. 6 silhouettes stepping out of 2 black SUVs, moving with the unmistakable precision of special operations. Their uniforms crisp and dark under the white exterior lights, their posture absolute, their presence impossible to misinterpret. My throat tightened. They were here earlier than expected. This was supposed to be a quiet courtesy visit, but nothing about Cheryl allowed quiet. I placed the tray down on the nearest table, straightened my back, and let my breath steady in my chest, the way I did before every mission debrief. It was time. The truth had finally arrived in the parking lot. and for the first time all night, I felt the ground shift under their feet, not mine. If you have ever been humiliated by your own family in front of a crowd, stay with me until the end. Because what happened when those operators entered that ballroom is something none of them saw coming. I was 12 when the first crack formed, the kind you do not notice, until years later when the entire foundation finally gives way. And by then it is too late to pretend the house you grew up in was ever stable. It was the fall of 2009 in Charlotte, and the air in our small brick home always smelled like the lavender lotion my mother Lydia used to soothe her hands after chemo. She tried to hide the pain from me, but a child can hear the difference between a sigh of relief and a sigh of surrender. She spent those last months telling me stories about her younger brother Mike, who had served in Iraq and came home with a limp and a heart full of ghosts. She said he had taught her that bravery was never loud and heroism rarely looked cinematic. Sometimes it was a person who stood still when the world tried to shove them aside. Sometimes it was choosing to walk into a storm because leaving others behind would break you more than the lightning itself. Those stories planted the first seeds of my dream to wear a uniform, not because I wanted glory, but because I wanted to belong to a place where courage mattered more than appearances. When she died in early 2010, nothing in the house felt anchored. My father, Daniel, moved like a man who had misplaced his identity, pacing through rooms as if waiting for Lydia to turn a corner and remind him how to live. But within 6 months, the empty spaces were filled by a woman named Cheryl. A spa owner with a bright smile and a sharper ambition, she arrived carrying scented candles and self-help books about manifesting a perfect life. She talked about the power of reinvention while rearranging everything my mother had touched. She married my father quickly and brought an energy into the house that felt glossy on the surface, but cold underneath. The day she moved in, she stood in the hallway scanning framed photos of my mother with a calculating expression. Then she took them down one by one, placing them into a cardboard box while saying, "We need a fresh start." Her tone light and breezy, as if she were tidying up after a holiday, not erasing a woman who had fought for every breath. I stood frozen watching her pack away Lydia like a seasonal decoration, and when she grabbed the old army jacket that had belonged to Uncle Mike, she grimaced and said, "This ugly army stuff does not match the house." I stepped forward trying to take it back, telling her it belonged to me now, a piece of my mother, a piece of family, but she slapped me lightly across the cheek, then leaned close enough for me to smell her perfume and whispered, "Do not you dare make me compete with a dead woman." My father stood in the doorway the entire time, and when my eyes filled with tears, he shook his head and muttered, "Do not be dramatic." Then he turned away, leaving me alone with a woman who knew exactly how to twist grief into obedience. It only got worse over the months that followed as Cheryl claimed the role of house authority with a confidence that came from knowing Daniel would always choose peace over conflict. She told relatives that I had been emotionally unstable since my mother died and needed structure, turning my heartbreak into a justification for her control. Whenever I got too quiet, she tilted her head and smiled sympathetically in front of guests, saying trauma can affect children in unpredictable ways, and they nodded as if my pain made me defective instead of human. I saw how easily a narrative could be shaped when the storyteller smiled enough. My interest in JROTC and military history books bothered her more than anything. She said reading about battles made me intense and weird. She told me that girls like me had no place in the army, that I should marry a man in uniform instead of pretending to be one. She laughed openly when I practiced my drills in the backyard, and once she actually recorded me marching, then showed it to her friends at the spa, saying, "Look at this little soldier girl trying to be serious." They chuckled while I burned with humiliation. One night, I overheard her talking to my father in the living room as I stood behind the staircase listening through the railing. She said, "Sloan is not leadership material. She gets too intense. We need to push her towards something safe, like HR or office administration, something where she cannot embarrass herself." Daniel murmured something about giving me time, but Cheryl shut him down with a sigh and said she needs direction, and I can give that to her, as if shaping me were another spa treatment on her list. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about how fast someone could rewrite your place in a family once they decided you were a burden. It was the first time I felt the quiet resolve that later defined my career, the sense that if the world narrowed its borders around me, I would carve new space with my own hands. The twist in all of this, the part no one in that house understood, was that the more Cheryl tried to shrink me, the more I clung to the fragments my mother left behind, especially the stories of Uncle Mike. So one afternoon I found the courage to take the bus across town to see him. He lived in a small duplex that smelled like old leather and coffee, and he moved with a stiffness that told stories more painful than words. He opened the door and looked at me for a long moment before letting me in as if measuring the weight I carried. I told him about Cheryl throwing away his jacket and his eyes tightened, but he did not say anything. He simply walked to a drawer and pulled out a challenge coin heavy and worn with the emblem of his Special Forces unit etched into the metal. He placed it in my palm and closed my fingers around it and said, "When the world tells you you are small, remember men like me would have followed a kid like you into hell." His voice steady and sure, in a way that made me feel taller than I ever had in my own home. That coin stayed hidden in my room under a loose floorboard for years, a silent promise that my worth did not depend on the woman who tried to erase my past or the father who let her. It was the first quiet step toward the person I later became, the one Cheryl would never see coming. By the time I was 17, the house no longer felt like a place where I grew up, but more like a narrow hallway lined with expectations that were never mine. It was 2013 in Charlotte, and I spent most afternoons running cross-country until my lungs burned because the rhythm of my feet on the track was the only space where I felt like I could breathe without someone telling me who I was supposed to be at school was the one arena I controlled, and I pushed myself hard in every class, finishing assignments, early keeping a perfect GPA, joining junior ROTC, because it gave me structure and a glimpse of the world I wanted to enter, one defined by discipline and purpose rather than appearances and manipulation. But inside the Archer household, Cheryl treated every achievement like a distraction from the life she imagined for me, and my father simply went along with whatever she declared. That summer, the JROTC program offered several leadership camps and field training events, and I begged to go, thinking maybe if they saw how committed I was, they would let me build something for myself. But Cheryl insisted I work weekends at her spa, folding towels, checking people in, learning what she called real skills. My father added that I should also spend time at the construction office to understand the family business, even though he knew I had no interest in it. They framed it as responsibility, but it felt like a leash. And whenever I mentioned wanting to prepare for a military future, Cheryl would sigh dramatically and say, "Girls like you need stability, not combat fantasies." Still, I kept my goals private and worked in silence because I had learned early that my dreams survived best in the spaces Cheryl could not see. So when I quietly submitted my application for the ROTC scholarship to UNC Charlotte, I did it after school, in the library, with trembling hands and a focus sharper than anything I had felt before it was my chance to earn my way in, without needing approval from people who only praised me when it benefited them. A few weeks later, I received an email inviting me to interview, and the moment I read it, my whole body felt lighter, because for the first time in years, the path ahead looked like one I could choose. I did not tell Cheryl or my father. Instead, I borrowed the car of a friend and drove across town wearing the only blazer I owned, one that still smelled faintly of my mother's cedar drawer. The officer who interviewed me listened intently as I talked about leadership, discipline, resilience, and the stories my mother had shared about Uncle Mike. The whole time, I kept thinking, do not let them erase this too. And when the officer shook my hand and said, "You have a real shot," I felt something like hope pulse through me. The acceptance letter arrived in our mailbox a month later in a large white envelope with the university crest stamped across the front. And I never saw it, because Cheryl did. She opened it first, As she always opened anything addressed to me if it looked official, then she hid it in her home office drawer for an entire week. During that week, she acted unusually sweet, offering me extra shifts at the spa, telling me that after graduation I could start full-time in management if I proved committed. I sensed something was off, but she tossed compliments like confetti, so I could not quite see what she was burying underneath. Then one night after dinner, she placed the envelope in front of me and said with a practiced smile, "So we talked and decided to allow this little phase of yours. When you are done playing soldier, you will come back and focus on a real career." She delivered the sentence as if the scholarship was a generous gift from her, rather than something I had earned with every hour of work, every mile run, every moment I refused to give up. I opened the letter and read the words, offering me a full scholarship, including tuition and a stipend. And instead of pride, my father only asked how long this Army thing was supposed to last because he had plans for me at the company. I swallowed the disappointment because fighting them never changed their narrative. And Cheryl kept emphasizing that this opportunity existed because they had allowed it, twisting my achievement into proof of their benevolence. It was the same story she always told others, that she sacrificed so much for me, ignoring the fact that she had spent years trying to shrink every part of who I was. The night before I was scheduled to sign the ROTC contract, my father knocked on my door and sat at the edge of my bed with the heavy sigh he used. Whenever he was about to pretend firmness, he said, "I need to make this clear. If you run off to the Army, I am not paying for anything after high school. You will be on your own." His tone lacked anger. It was simply resignation, as if abandoning me. Financially was an administrative choice rather than emotional rejection. I looked at him and felt a familiar emptiness settle in because I knew he was not warning me. He was freeing himself, and I thought better alone than owned. The next day, I signed the papers with a steady hand that surprised me. I chose a future where I would have to work twice as hard, but every step would belong to me and not a woman who believed she had the right to sculpt me into her image. After the signing ceremony, I sat in the parking lot holding the folder of documents when a sudden clarity hit me. If I wanted to truly break free, I needed to cut off every channel they used to claim control. Mini revenge number 1 was quiet, almost invisible, yet powerful. I contacted the financial aid office and submitted paperwork to change my dependency status, listing the documents that proved estrangement and financial instability at home. Once approved, my FAFSA no longer involved my parents, and all future financial decisions belonged solely to me. They would not be able to access anything, tax-related, scholarship-related, or university-related, and more importantly, they would never again be able to claim they paid for or built the foundation of my career. It was a protective measure disguised as a formality, and I knew Cheryl would never see it coming. In the months that followed, she kept telling people she supported my dream, even though she had never supported anything except the version of me that made her look good at church events and business dinners. But I carried my acceptance letter folded neatly in my journal like a vow that the next chapter would be mine entirely, the beginning of the journey that would one day make the world call me Valkyrie, even as my own family insisted I was nothing more than a girl playing soldier. By 2018, the distance between who my family thought I was and who I was becoming had stretched so far it felt like two separate worlds, one built on their dismissive assumptions and one built on quiet discipline and the growing certainty that I could survive without any of them. Commissioning day at UNC Charlotte was supposed to be the bridge between those worlds, a moment where the people who raised me could witness the culmination of every late-night study session, every early morning run, every forgotten meal, every sacrifice I had made since signing my contract. The campus was buzzing with energy that morning as cadets adjusted their uniforms and families snapped photos in the sunlight that filtered through the courtyard. Parents held bouquets, siblings held handmade signs, and instructors walked around shaking hands with the kind of pride that comes from seeing potential turn into purpose. I kept scanning the seating area looking for my family. The rows of folding chairs set up under the white canopy were filling quickly, and every seat carried some symbol of love. A jacket draped over the back, a parent waving to someone on stage, a sibling shouting, "We are proud of you." But my row remained empty. 3 chairs with my name taped neatly along the top untouched as the ceremony time drew closer. I pulled out my phone and called Cheryl, reminding her gently that the event was starting soon, and she responded in her cheerful voice that Tyler had a big photo shoot for a new brand partnership, and it would be terrible for him to miss it, since opportunities like this do not come often. She said they tried to make it work, but schedules were impossible, and Daniel echoed her in the background saying, "I should not be dramatic because the Army would have plenty of ceremonies anyway." I stood there listening to them justify their absence as if it were a minor scheduling conflict rather than a deliberate erasure, and for a moment the sting felt sharp enough to make my breath catch. The MC began announcing the graduates, calling out achievements as each cadet stepped forward. He spoke of awards earned, physical fitness scores, and leadership performance, and when he reached my name, he mentioned my top ranking in the class, my 2-mile run time that broke the school record, and my consistently high scores in intelligence and strategy analysis. The applause that followed felt warm and sincere. Yet when I stepped onto the stage to receive the ceremonial officer's sword and the engraved watch given to each newly commissioned officer, my eyes drifted instinctively to the empty chairs where my family was supposed to sit, and for a heartbeat, I felt smaller than I had in years, smaller even than the girl Cheryl once slapped for defending her mother's jacket. I kept my posture straight, smiled, shook hands with the officials, and returned to my seat, pretending not to feel the hollow ache of being the only cadet in my row, without someone cheering for them. Humiliation settled quietly like dust, not loud enough for anyone else to notice, but heavy enough to shape the moment permanently. As the ceremony ended, a man in uniform approached the instructors at the edge of the stage. He carried himself with the calm authority that comes from decades of knowing exactly who you are in the Army. Tall, broad-shouldered eyes sharp behind wire-framed glasses, and a command presence that made other officers instinctively shift to make space. I recognized him vaguely as a senior representative attending on behalf of the Army, though I did not yet know his name. He watched me for a moment with an expression that was neither pity nor surprise, but something assessing something that felt like recognition. Later, I would learn. He was Colonel Hayes, a man whose influence reached far into the special operations community and whose opinion could change the course of a career. He leaned toward the senior instructor of our program and said something I caught only in fragments, but enough to know it mattered. Keep an eye on archer kids like her, either change the game or burn out. Trying the words landed in my chest like a long-delayed validation echoing louder than any applause I had received that day, because they came from someone who saw what my own family refused to look at. After the ceremony, the cadets spilled out into the courtyard where families hugged and took pictures and made dinner plans. I stood near a column sipping a soda, the condensation dripping onto my glove as I forced a smile for a group photo with classmates and their parents. The camera captured a version of me that looked composed, but inside I felt like I was standing in a glass box, watching everyone else experience a joy. I was denied. My phone buzzed with a notification, and I checked it, thinking maybe Cheryl had reconsidered and sent a message acknowledging the milestone. But instead, it was a post from her social media account, a photo of Tyler posing in downtown Charlotte, holding a new product with the caption, "Proud of my son, Tyler's brand deal. Today, not one word about my commissioning. Not one acknowledgement that I had opened a door most people never reach. The timing was not accidental. It was a declaration that the only achievements worth celebrating were the ones that benefited her image. I swallowed the disappointment as I always did, and excused myself from the crowd, stepping away until the sounds of families laughing blended into white noise. Something inside me hardened, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I realized in that moment that expecting them to show up was just another form of hope that chipped away at me slowly, and hope was a luxury I could no longer afford if I wanted to build a life independent of their rewriting of my story. Mini revenge number 2 formed quietly in the hours after the ceremony, the kind of decision that seemed small but would change everything. Later, I logged into my university email and removed Cheryl's access since she had insisted on being included for emergencies. Then I disabled all automatic forwarding. She had set up on my account during my freshman year, claiming she needed to keep track of my deadlines for my own good from that day forward. No academic updates, no Army program announcements, no internship offers, no performance evaluations would pass through her anymore. The pipeline of information she used to monitor me was cut clean. From then on, my progress existed entirely outside the Archer household. And if they ever knew anything about my career, it would be because someone else told them or they overheard it by accident, not because I needed their support or their approval. That evening, while my classmates had dinner with their proud families, I walked alone across campus, feeling the weight of the sword in its case against my leg and the watch ticking softly against my wrist, reminders that the Army had claimed me, even if my own family had not. I promised myself that the next time I stepped onto a stage, wearing a uniform, it would not matter who sat in the chairs, because the people who understood my worth did not need to share my last name. And one day, those empty seats would become the most powerful part of my story. By the time I arrived at Fort Liberty in early 2019, the person I had been on commissioning day felt like a distant echo, replaced slowly by someone sharper and steadier, and much quieter. Someone who had learned that silence was not weakness, but a kind of armor, the type you needed when walking into rooms where every decision could redirect the course of an entire mission. I completed the Military Intelligence Captain's Career Course faster than most of my cohort, because I treated every long night of study and every training simulation as if a real team were already depending on me. And somewhere along the way, that intensity started catching the attention of officers who did not usually bother learning the names of new captains. When the selection message arrived assigning me to a Special Operations Task Force, I read it 3 times to make sure it was real. My hands trembling slightly, as if my body understood before my mind did that this moment would change everything I reported to the compound, with my hair tied back tightly, my posture straight, but my heartbeat loud in my ears, and I walked into a world where rank mattered, but competence mattered more. Where no one cared if your family attended your ceremonies or if you grew up listening to someone call you too intense here. The only measure was whether you could keep Americans alive. The pivotal mission came in late 2020 in a blistering stretch of the Sahel where the horizon looked like a wall of heat, shivering over sand. Our intelligence feeds had been inconsistent for days, broken by static and dust storms, and the convoy we were supporting moved through a corridor known for hidden traps and unpredictable hostile movement. I spent the morning in the small intel room surrounded by screens, maps, and markers, watching patterns form and dissolve as the drone sent back grainy bursts of information. Then I caught something, a flicker on the edge of one frame that did not match the previous 2 hours of imagery. Barely visible, but enough to make my breath pause a line in the sand. Too straight to be natural, too deliberate to be wind-carved. I zoomed in, adjusted filters, recalculated angles, and in the pit of my stomach, I felt the cold certainty that the convoy was about to roll into a lethal setup. I sent the alert immediately rewriting their route in the last 7 minutes before they reached the danger zone. The operations officer questioned the change for half a second, then trusted the tone in my voice and relayed the order. The convoy veered right instead of left, and 15 minutes later the drone captured the explosion of an IED buried exactly where their original route had been. Intel later confirmed that at least 5 people would have died if the team had stayed on course. Hearing the after-action report felt surreal, because the words lives saved and decisive call were spoken about choices that had unfolded in my hands in real time, while I sat alone in a dimly lit room with only the hum of machines and the rhythm of my own pulse guiding me. When the team returned, they walked straight to the Intel building, still dusty and exhausted, with adrenaline fading from their eyes. Someone pounded on the door, and when I opened it, the whole group stood there. They slapped a challenge coin onto my desk and shouted Valkyrie in unison, the name echoing down the hallway with a kind of fierce loyalty that I had never experienced in my own home. It was not planned, not formal, but it carried the weight of everything they felt, but could not show publicly. That moment cemented the call sign that would follow me through every deployment. After that, one people I had never met would nod when hearing my last name and say, "So that is the Valkyrie, the one who sees what others miss." My name began to circulate quietly in places my family would never imagine, on internal forums where operators shared lessons learned, and on military subreddits where someone posted a blurred version of the coin video, captioned with "Intel saves lives," to one day an article for military families appeared titled, "The Woman Behind the Route Change." But because of confidentiality, it simply listed Captain S. Archer, call sign Valkyrie, with no picture. I saw the article shared online but said nothing, and later I found out Cheryl had scrolled past it while browsing on her phone. She did not even pause long enough to read my initials. During a short deployment break, I called home to check in, even though every conversation left me feeling like I was pressing against a wall that refused to move. I shared only the bare minimum, saying we lost someone, but we saved many a sentence, heavy with grief and relief intertwined. But before I could say more, Cheryl cut in with her usual dismissive tone, saying, "This is why real adults do not join the Army. All that drama and trauma, you will never have a normal life at this rate." Remember staring at the floor, hearing her voice crackling through the phone like static, and thinking she had no idea that the things she labeled dramatic were moments where people lived or died because of decisions she would never have the courage to make. Tyler joined the call briefly to show off a new camera setup for his live streams, and he joked loudly to his audience about his sister working in a secret basement pushing buttons. Not exactly Rambo, you guys more like support staff with a security badge. His viewers laughed, and I realized in that moment how deeply the Archer family needed the narrative of me being small, because acknowledging anything else would force them to confront the truth that I had built everything without them. I hung up gently without arguing because I had learned that my silence unnerved them more than any confrontation, and I redirected my thoughts to something that mattered. I logged into my banking portal and changed the automatic transfer that used to send part of my pay to Daniel under the guise of investing in the family business. Instead, I rerouted my hazard pay and deployment bonus to a veterans center in Charlotte and to a relief fund for military families. But I signed every donation as V. Archer. No full name, no rank, no link to the Archer household. It was my way of supporting the world that supported me without allowing my family to claim credit for generosity they never offered. What I did not know then was how poetic that choice would become years later, when the same veterans center would be the place Cheryl and Daniel sought help from during their downfall, never realizing that the funds keeping that center alive came from the daughter they belittled, dismissed, and labeled support staff. The daughter who was already quietly rewriting their future while they still believed they controlled hers. Coming home after a deployment always felt like stepping through two separate doors at once, one leading back into the world where my decisions carried weight, where people trusted me with lives and intelligence and crisis, and the other pulling me into a house where none of that mattered because Cheryl had spent years training everyone to see me as the ungrateful child who needed constant correction. In early 2021, I returned on emergency leave with a stitched shoulder from a rocket attack that had rattled an entire outpost and left me with a pounding headache that pulsed behind my eyes. Whenever I moved too quickly, the injury was minor compared to what could have happened, yet it earned me hazard pay and a bonus meant to compensate for risks so severe it could have ended everything money I had earned inch by inch, across nights, without sleep, analyzing patterns, under red lights, while the sound of distant fire thudded like a heartbeat. I arrived at the Archer home expecting at least a quiet evening, But instead, I walked into a kitchen so pristine and sparkling, it looked like a photograph, white marble counters that reflected the overhead lights, polished brass handles on brand new cabinets, an island twice the size of the one we used to have. Cheryl stood by the stove swirling a glass of wine with the triumphant smile of someone who wanted applause. She said, "Look what we did while you were gone," as if the new kitchen were a family achievement and not something she had orchestrated for her own image. I touched the edge of the counter, still cold and smooth under my palm, and felt confusion rise slowly because I knew my father did not have the money for this kind of remodeling after 2 stalled contracts and a slow quarter in the business. During dinner, Cheryl sat at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her voice overly bright. Then she laughed lightly and said, "You will appreciate this more than anyone, Sloan. We use some of your deployment money as a down payment for the new kitchen. You will eat here when you come home, so it is basically for you too." The words dropped into the room like a stone, and I stared at her waiting for the punchline. But her expression never shifted. My fork froze halfway to my mouth, while she took another sip of wine as if she had just shared a funny family anecdote. I said slowly that I had never agreed to give them that money. But Daniel chimed in before I could finish saying, "You would not have survived without us raising you. This is us getting a little bit back." He said it with a shrug as if he were explaining taxes and not justifying taking money earned on the other side of fear and fire. I kept replaying their words in my mind. Everything you are is because we took care of you. Everything you do is owed back to us. Everything you earn is never really yours, because you would be nothing. Without this house, without this family, without our guidance, the narrative was so twisted it made my stomach tighten. They had turned my service, my danger, my sacrifice into a debt I could never finish paying off while praising themselves for giving me a place to sleep during childhood, as if that erased their years of silence and mockery. After dinner, I retreated to my old room, needing air, needing clarity, and I logged into my bank account to see what had actually happened. The numbers made my breath catch in my throat, because I suddenly remembered something stupid and naive I had done when first joining the Army in the chaos of paperwork and moving across states. I had asked my father to look over one of my accounts because I was unsure about an automatic transfer. I had forgotten completely that he or someone connected to him might still have joint access, and now I saw it clearly: several quiet transfers labeled as routine withdrawals, small enough to avoid suspicion, but large enough that over time they added up to the exact down payment Cheryl bragged about during dinner. The betrayal felt sharper than the wound on my shoulder money I earned in a war zone, flowing into an account belonging to someone who spent years telling me I was playing soldier. I found Cheryl in the living room later scrolling her phone, and I confronted her with the facts laid straight and simple. She did not deny it. Instead, she raised her voice until it echoed off the walls and yelled, "Everything you are is because we fed you, clothed you, and tolerated your Army phase." Her face flushed as she said tolerated, like my service was a messy hobby she had graciously endured rather than the career that kept strangers safe. Daniel stood behind her, rubbing his forehead as if the conversation inconvenienced him more than the theft itself. I wanted to scream, but the years had taught me that silence was sharper than anger. So I simply nodded, once turned around and walked back down the hallway. I did not slam the door. I did not argue. I did not explain what the money meant or how hard it had been earned. I only felt something inside me settle like a final lock, turning on a door I should have closed years earlier. Mini revenge number 4 began forming as a quiet sequence of decisions. First, I closed that old account entirely, transferring every remaining dollar into my military credit union, where no one in the Archer household had any authority. Then I spent the next morning on base, speaking with JAG to review my financial documents, insurance beneficiaries, emergency contacts, and legal protections. By the time I finished every tie that once allowed my family even the smallest access to my affairs was severed cleanly. They would not be notified if something happened to me. They would not receive a cent of my insurance. They would not be listed on any base contact sheet, ever again to them. These changes were invisible because their egos convinced them they understood everything about my life, while in reality, they understood nothing. The strange part was how quickly the shift calmed me, a quiet, dark tunnel forming inside my chest where anger gave way to exhaustion. I felt stretched thin between two worlds. In the field, I was trusted with decisions that shaped missions, but at home, I was reduced to a girl who owed everything to people who had never shown up for a single ceremony. I saved lives for a living, yet could not convince my own family that my life had value outside the roles they assigned. Lying awake that night, I stared at the ceiling and realized no one was coming to rescue me from this cycle. The Army had taught me how to protect others, but now I needed to learn how to protect myself. And the first step was understanding that loyalty meant nothing to people who saw you only as a resource to drain. Sleep had become a thin, uneven thread that snapped every time I closed my eyes. Flashes of the last mission cutting through the dark, even when I tried to steady my breathing, because no matter how many times I replayed the debrief or traced the chain of decisions frame by frame, the outcome always stabbed at the same place inside me. We lost a teammate during an extraction west of the river, and although every tactical review confirmed that the call I made had saved the majority of the unit, I could not stop hearing the whisper that said, if you were better, he would still be here. That whisper followed me through chow halls and briefings and PT until even my commanding officer noticed the tightness around my voice and sent me to behavioral health for mandatory sessions, something the Army did not frame as punishment, but still felt like stepping into a room where all the noise in my mind echoed louder. The therapy office at Fort Liberty looked ordinary to the point of insult, a small neutral space with a single chair facing another, a whiteboard with markers, a soft lamp in the corner that cast a warm glow across the carpet. And I sat there feeling out of place like someone who had been dropped through a ceiling into a world that moved too quietly. The therapist, Dr. Rowan, did not rush me. He simply waited until the silence stretched long enough that the words inside me had nowhere else to go except out. I started with the mission because it felt easier than talking about home, describing the angles of movement, the timing, the pressure, the way you can do everything right and still lose someone, because war does not respond to perfection or hope. But then without meaning to, I drifted into the story, beneath the story. The one about the kitchen remodel, the stolen money, the humiliation at my commissioning. The years of being reduced to the girl who should be grateful for a roof and a plate of food, even when I was the one building a life none of them had ever believed I could manage. I said, I feel like I'm always apologizing for existing. And Dr. Rowan leaned back slightly and asked a question that made my stomach clench because of how simple it was on a mission. Do you wait for everyone to approve your plan? He asked it like he already knew the answer. I shook my head and said, no, I analyze, I decide, I execute because hesitation kills and someone has to make the call. He nodded once, then looked directly at me. So why is your family the only place where you hand them the pen and let them write who you are? I sat there staring at him, hearing the words over and over, because something in them cut deeper than any after-action review had ever done. He said it gently, but with a surgeon's precision. You treat your family like a chain of command that outranks your own judgment, and you do not do that with anyone else. Not with your soldiers, not with your intelligence, not with your life. It hit me that I had spent years waiting for permission to step into the identity I had already earned, and I felt shame, but also anger curling through my chest, as if a tight knot had finally loosened enough to let air in. Dr. Rowan called it a covert family operation, a term that made me blink because I had never connected the patterns so clearly. He said, it looks like you have been running a covert operation in your own house, taking hits, covering for them, letting them claim credit and letting them define the narrative. Why do you think you keep doing that? I tried to answer, but all I managed was a fragmented because they are my family. But even as I said it, I heard how weak it sounded. The Army demanded sacrifice, but it never demanded self-erasure. My team respected me. My commanders trusted me. My peers sought my judgment. Yet in the Archer household, I was an asset to be used, polished, displayed, or dismissed, depending on how it benefited Cheryl's curated image. I sat still for several seconds, then said quietly, "I am more loyal to them than they have ever been to me, and I do not know why." He said, "You know why, you just have not said it aloud yet." And something in my chest cracked, because the truth was simple and raw. I wanted them to choose me the way my unit did, consistently, fully, without hesitation, but they never had, and never would, and that realization felt like stepping into a cold night after years of stale air. Before leaving the room, Dr. Rowan handed me a small notepad and said, "Write down the lines you will not let them cross anymore. Start with one and keep going until the page scares you in a good way." That night in my barracks room, I sat on my bunk and wrote a list, slowly at first, then faster, as if the ink were dragging truth out of places I had buried. I wrote no more access to my money, no more letting them rewrite my role, no more attending family events where I exist only as a prop, no more permitting mockery disguised as love, no more silence when they harm me and call it care. The list grew until the last line read, "I refuse to shrink myself for people who benefit from my smallness." The next morning during a routine briefing, Colonel Hayes asked me to stay behind for a moment, and his tone told me it was not a reprimand. He shut the door and said your name came up in places where even I do not usually hear intel officers mentioned, which startled me because he was not a man who spoke in exaggerations. He continued, "The Pentagon wants you to brief for a joint task force next quarter," and I felt the words land like a quiet thunder, heavier and brighter than anything Cheryl had ever imagined for me. This was the type of recognition that did not come from luck or image, but from work performed under pressure, where mistakes cost lives. I nodded and thanked him, but the truth was I already knew how I would handle it, because as I walked back down the hallway toward the operations floor, another part of the list formed in my mind. This promotion, this briefing, this status would stay silent until the day it did not. I would not tell my father or Cheryl or Tyler. I would not give them a chance to twist it into something they could take credit for or diminish. If they wanted status, they would only see it when it stood in front of them, undeniable and public and too large for their narrative to swallow. That decision felt like the first real breath I had taken in months, the beginning of a shift so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, if not for the calm that settled across my shoulders. For the first time since childhood, I felt the faint outline of a life where I belonged wholly to myself and no one else, and I promised silently that the next time my family tried to shrink me, I would not bend, I would not fold, I would not erase myself to make them comfortable. September 2024 settled over Fort Liberty with the kind of thick late summer heat that clung to uniforms and made the air shimmer above the pavement. Yet beneath that heaviness, I felt something sharp and electric building inside me, because for the first time, the lines I had drawn in therapy were not just words on a page, but a blueprint for what came next. The Army was shifting me toward a joint task force briefing, and the timing aligned with an outreach event in Charlotte, a coincidence that would have meant nothing months earlier, but now felt like the universe handing me a clean stage. Colonel Hayes called me into his office one morning, the door clicking shut with the same deliberate motion he used during classified briefings, and he said Fort Liberty is partnering with a veterans center in Charlotte for a weekend event, honoring service members with complex family histories. We could use a story like yours. Captain, a high-performing intel officer with a rough home front, would you consider doing a closed-door talk? His voice held no pressure, only respect. And for a moment, I imagined standing there explaining quietly how duty and blood had never aligned the way people assumed. I agreed almost instantly, then hesitated because an idea had been forming at the edges of my mind since therapy, a plan that was not vengeance for the sake of punishment, but closure for the sake of survival. So I said, "If possible, sir, Could we schedule the Charlotte visit on the same weekend as my father's birthday? He paused just long enough for me to know he understood everything. I was not saying, his expression unreadable, the way only seasoned officers manage. Then he nodded once and said, "Consider it done, Captain." That was the moment the battlefield shifted, because this would not be some petty stunt or theatrical reveal. It would be the first time I placed myself in the center of my own story and refused to let Cheryl or Daniel twist the narrative to suit their image. The plan took shape quickly and quietly in the afternoon. I would speak at the Veterans Center, the same place that for years had been receiving anonymous donations, signed V. Archer funds that had come from my hazard pay and deployment bonuses when my family siphoned what they could from me. Then in the evening, a small group from my Special Operations Task Force would stop by my father's birthday gathering as part of a sanctioned public relations outreach. Strictly voluntary, fully professional, no uniforms used for spectacle or defiance, just protocol reflecting my position exactly as it existed on base. Mini Revenge Number 6 formed in the background like a seed sprouting under concrete. I asked the Veterans Center coordinator to extend a general invitation to my father and Cheryl, sometime in the future, to tour the facility, an invitation that revealed nothing about the donor who kept their programs afloat. I imagined the moment months from now when they would walk into a room filled with resources paid for by the daughter they had belittled for years, and how quietly poetic that justice would feel. Meanwhile, the family group chat buzzed with Cheryl's usual directives. She wrote dress code classy, no uniforms. Sloan, it is Dad's night, not Army night. The message glowed with the same tone she had used my entire life, the one that insisted I shrink to fit a narrative where she always stood in the center. I replied, "Got it. I will wear something simple because arguing would have been wasted." Breath in reality, I had no intention of wearing a uniform. I had no need to uniforms, where symbols and symbols carry weight, but this time I wanted them to see the weight carried by the people who respected me, not the fabric on my body. If the Army wanted to send representatives to greet me at the party, then their presence would speak louder than any medal. The twist began when I drafted an email to Colonel Hayes that took longer to write than any intelligence summary I had submitted in the past year. I typed, "Sir, if my family tries to belittle my role, I will not argue back. I will let protocol speak for itself. All I ask is that you treat me there the same way you treat me on base." My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I wondered if I had crossed some invisible line. But then I realized I was not asking for favoritism. I was asking for truth. The reply came an hour later, concise and steady. "We would not know how to treat you any less than Captain Archer, ma'am." Those words settled into my chest like armor, because for the first time in my life, someone in authority was telling me I did not need to shrink to be respected. In the days leading up to the trip, I prepared my briefing materials, but also rehearsed the emotional terrain I knew awaited me. There would be the usual chandeliers and too loud laughter and Cheryl's curated perfection that always felt like suffocation. There would be Tyler making jokes about how I pushed paper in a bunker. There would be Daniel smiling tightly as though my presence disrupted his peaceful evening, instead of honoring him on his birthday. Yet beneath all of that, there would also be my team soldiers who had followed my calls, in places where sunlight never reached men and women who had seen me predict an ambush with seconds to spare or redirect a convoy out of an IED trap. They would stand beside me the same way they did in briefing rooms and operations tents, and their respect would act like a mirror for my family to see what they had refused to see for years. On the flight to Charlotte, I stared out the window at the grid of lights below, thinking about how many times I had walked into that house, wishing someone would ask how I was really doing, wishing Daniel would look up from his phone long enough to see the fear I carried after missions, wishing Cheryl would offer even 1 ounce of empathy instead of criticism, wishing Tyler would stop making jokes that cut deeper than he knew. But now, all of that longing had gone quiet, replaced by the steady certainty that I no longer needed approval to exist. Planning the evening felt like planning a mission compressed into a family function. I coordinated with Hayes on arrival timing, reviewed the Veterans Center schedule, and made sure the team's presence would be strictly within regulation. Nothing performative, nothing improper, just a brief courtesy visit to acknowledge my role. The real strategy lived inside. The silence I intended to hold. If Cheryl insulted me, I would not defend myself. If Daniel dismissed my work, I would let the officers beside me establish reality. If Tyler mocked me, I would not flinch. The more they tried to paint me small, the more obvious the contrast would become. The night before the event, I reread the list from therapy, the one labeled lines. I will not let them cross anymore, and felt the power of how far I had come since the moment I wrote it. Tomorrow was not about revenge. In the cinematic sense, it was about breaking a pattern that had been draining me for years, a pattern that ended the moment my team walked into that room and addressed me with the title, "My Family Had Never Once Spoken." With sincerity, Captain Archer. The night of the party unfolded exactly the way I had predicted, yet somehow the familiar patterns still pressed against my nerves, like old bruises being touched. The house glowed with curated perfection, the way Cheryl loved it, to candles arranged in symmetrical lines, white tablecloths ironed so precisely the seams looked painted on, and soft music playing from speakers. She insisted made the house feel upscale, even though they always sounded slightly tinny. I walked through the doorway with a calm that had not existed in earlier years, because this time I was no longer stepping into the role they wrote for me. I was stepping into a battlefield mapped in therapy and prepared with intention. Cheryl spotted me immediately, and her expression tightened by a degree so small it would be invisible to anyone who had not spent years studying her moods. She pressed a hand to my arm and said, "Perfect timing. I need you to carry out the extra wine glasses. Check the serving line and fix that corner napkin setup. It is uneven." The commands came out crisp, like she was directing staff at her spa, instead of speaking to a daughter who had deployed twice. I nodded without blinking, letting her think she had placed me in the same box as always, because this time compliance was camouflage, not surrender. Guests began filtering in, wearing dresses and button-downs and overly polished shoes, and Cheryl switched into her public persona with an ease that always felt like watching someone step into a costume. She moved from group to group, greeting neighbors and extended relatives, then waving me over with a bright smile that never reached her eyes. She said, "This is Sloan. She helps with Army admin support staff. You know how it is. Paperwork and schedules and all that behind-the-scenes stuff." The words slid out, coated in sugar, but designed to cut down to bone. A woman from across the street nodded sympathetically and said, "My nephew lost his leg in Afghanistan. At least you are not in danger, dear," which turned my deployments into something soft and trivial, something that conveniently fit Cheryl's version of me. I held my expression steady because I had learned long ago that my silence made them nervous in ways my anger never did inside. I watched each belittling comment the way I watched terrain through a drone feed, marking each insult as if annotating a map. Nothing they said surprised me anymore, but every remark solidified the lines I had drawn in therapy. No more letting them write who I was. Tyler arrived fashionably late, wearing designer sneakers and the brand jacket he flaunted in every post. He clapped me on the back too hard and said, "Hey sis, can I borrow one of your jackets for a TikTok? I want to do a POV having a soldier sister video. It will get insane views. Trust me," I said without hesitation. Uniforms are not props, and his face deflated with visible annoyance because he was used to me giving in for the sake of peace. He muttered something about me being overly serious, then wandered off to film himself beside the drink table. What he did not know was that earlier that afternoon I had sent a short email to the Army's Public Affairs Office documenting how he previously used the Army logo incorrectly in a sponsored post, a violation the brand had been warned about once. Already, I knew the company would receive a notice soon, and I knew at least one of his deals would quietly evaporate. Mini Revenge number 7 slipped into place like the click of a well-fitted part, and nobody in that house had even sensed the shift. At dinner, Cheryl made a show of tapping her glass with a fork, calling everyone's attention as she lifted her wine with the grace of someone stepping into a spotlight she believed she deserved. She said, "Thank you all for being here on Daniel's special day. Family means everything to us, and we are so proud of our son Tyler, thriving and working with major brands." Then her smile thinned in the direction of my chair, and she added, "And of course, we are glad Sloan could help tonight. She is just support staff. Real operators do not have time for family dinners anyway." Laughter rippled through the room, soft, polite, and oblivious to the cruelty embedded in her phrasing. She sipped her wine as if she had said something charming instead of dismissive. The words landed, but not the way she intended, because for the first time they did not pierce me. They only echoed the truth I already knew Cheryl had always needed to shrink me, so her own reflection could stand taller for years. I mistook that as a flaw in me. But therapy had pulled the curtain back, revealing the machinery behind every comment, every humiliation, every rewrite of my achievements. I felt the old reflex rising, the urge to defend myself or explain that my work did not resemble paperwork or admin or support roles the way she described. But I let the impulse die untouched. I simply took a sip of water and let the silence breathe, because this time I was not here to win a debate. I was here to let reality reveal itself in its own timing. From my seat, I caught the eye of the club manager, a quiet man named Rylan, whom I had spoken to earlier in the day. I had told him that if a group of officers arrived, he should bring them straight into the main hall without having them wait at the entrance or be directed through the kitchen. He had nodded with the seriousness of someone who understood his role in a larger plan, even without knowing all the details. Now he approached me at a brisk pace, leaning in just enough that only I could hear him whisper, "They are here." The words felt like a sudden shift in air pressure the moment before a storm breaks my heartbeat, steadied in a way that surprised me because I had imagined feeling a rush of vindication or triumph. Instead, I felt calm, grounded, almost surgical, as if the past 15 years of belittlement had led to this clean point of clarity. The part of me that had spent a lifetime apologizing grew still, and I set my glass down slowly, knowing everything was about to change. The moment Rylan whispered, "They are here," the air in the banquet hall shifted so quickly it felt like every sound was pulled taut, then suspended, and I walked toward the center of the room carrying years of swallowed humiliation, like silent armor. The conversations around me blurred into a low hum as the double doors at the front of the hall opened with a quiet, controlled movement that somehow commanded more attention than any dramatic entrance could have. And in stepped 6 members of the Special Operations Team in full combat uniform patches, precise boots clean but worn by real work, their posture grounded and unshakable. The presence they carried was unmistakable. Even to civilians who had only seen uniforms in movies, the entire room fell into abrupt silence, as if someone had cut the power to every unnecessary sound. A few guests gasped softly, and one elderly man murmured, "That must be a surprise for Daniel, since his daughter is in the army," and someone else whispered, "Maybe they are here to honor the father," because they certainly were not expecting a woman carrying a serving tray to be the reason an elite unit walked into a country club on a Saturday night. Cheryl straightened her shoulders, assuming the spotlight must somehow be drifting in her direction. Daniel adjusted his collar with nervous pride. Tyler pulled out his phone instinctively, but stopped when the team's energy made recording feel wrong. Colonel Hayes scanned the gathered crowd with a practiced eye, then found me where I stood a few steps back from the center table. He walked forward with the steady, deliberate gait of someone who had commanded soldiers through situations that would reduce most people to adrenaline shaking. He stopped 2 paces from me and brought his hand sharply up in a salute that cracked through the room like a lightning strike. "Captain Archer, ma'am, requesting permission to enter your AO," the words carried authority and respect in a tone that left no doubt that this was protocol, not performance. My body moved before emotion could catch up, years of training aligning my posture and voice as I returned the salute and said, "Permission granted, sir." the hall remained frozen in absolute stillness, because for the first time that evening, every person inside was looking directly at me, not as a helper, not as support staff, not as the girl carrying plates, but as someone being addressed with formal deference by a special operations commander. Colonel Hayes turned to the crowd and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, sorry to intrude. We are here because your support staff has saved more American lives in the past 5 years than most of us will ever know." His voice was measured but carried a weight that pressed heavily into the stunned silence, and I saw several guests straighten instinctively as if responding to an unspoken command. He unfolded a small card and read a non-classified summary the way officers do when navigating the line between honoring someone's service and protecting operational integrity. He listed missions, shaped by my analysis ambushes avoided because of route changes. I made evacuation corridors. I plotted under pressure decisions that allowed teams to return home to their families and hostages who were alive, because intel had aligned at the right moment. He did not embellish anything yet. The simplicity of facts alone carried more force than any dramatic speech could have. I stood still, but inside my mind flashed across nights at Fort Liberty, when maps glowed under red lights and operators waited on my call. I felt something rise in my chest, a mix of validation and grief for every moment I had doubted myself because of the casual cruelty of the people, standing feet away from me now, staring in disbelief. Ortiz stepped forward holding a small shadow box and opened it carefully, revealing an array of challenge coins and patches from various units. He said these aren't given to support staff. They're given to people we would follow anywhere. The room reacted with a collective intake of breath that felt almost ceremonial challenge. Coins are not trinkets. They are earned in quiet places where the world cannot see, and being offered them publicly was a statement none of my family could spin away. A woman in a navy dress stepped closer. Her eyes narrowed in recognition, and she said, "Wait, I read that article. The route change in the Sahel. The intel officer they called Valkyrie was a woman. Captain S. Archer, is that you that Valkyrie?" And for the first time since I was 12 years old, a room full of people looked at me not through the lens Cheryl had built, not through the diminished version Daniel preferred, but through the stark truth of who I had become, through battles they never saw. Cheryl's face drained of color so fast it looked like someone had pulled a curtain from her expression. She stammered, "We always knew she was special. We just joke like family does." You know how families tease her voice, shook with the strain of trying to rewrite the past 20 minutes and the past 20 years. In one breath, Daniel offered a weak, strained smile and said, "We are very proud of her." His voice trembling on every word because he understood too late that the narrative he had allowed Cheryl to shape no longer fit the reality standing in front of him in uniform surrounded by elite soldiers. I looked at both of them with a steadiness I did not know I was capable of holding in public and said, "You have always been proud of the version of me you could control. This is the real one." The sentence was calm, unthreatening, almost gentle, but the truth inside it hit like an unshielded blast because I saw the immediate recoil in Cheryl's eyes and the flicker of shame in Daniel's. The team stayed beside me, forming a natural protective arc around my position, not out of necessity, but out of respect, and the entire hall shifted its axis around that moment as though decades of belittlement had slid off my shoulders and landed at the feet of the people who had placed it there. Before the night could move forward, I posed a question that reached deeper than the room itself. If you were standing where I stood, hearing your family claim pride after years of erasing your worth, what would you say? What would you choose? Comment below and tell me how you would answer in my place, because maybe someone out there needs to hear they are not alone. The fallout did not explode all at once the way people imagine it would after a moment that dramatic. Instead, it began as a quiet ripple spreading from one phone to another as a few guests who had nervously filmed the salute posted short clips with captions like, When a family calls her support staff and the special ops team walks in, and by the time I drove back toward Fort Liberty that night, the clips had already started circulating through veteran circles and civic groups on TikTok and YouTube Shorts, where the algorithm tends to amplify anything that touches raw pride or disrespect toward military service. The comments grew beneath the videos faster than I expected, and each notification brought a mix of validation and sorrow, because the first wave of viewers were mostly older mothers who had sent sons and daughters into uniform, and they wrote things like, "As a mom of a soldier, this breaks my heart," or "That stepmom should be ashamed." And I realized that strangers understood the weight of what my own family had refused to carry for years. The next shock hit my father's construction company, which had long branded itself as a business that supported troops posting yellow ribbon stickers on trucks and adding veterans first messaging on brochures. Yet the strangers online discovered quickly that the man who claimed patriotic loyalty was the same man who stood silently while his wife publicly belittled his daughter's service, and a retired sergeant who had a pending renovation contract with Daniel posted a comment saying, "I cannot work with people who do not respect their own soldier." Within 2 days, he canceled the agreement and shared the reason openly, which triggered more clients to quietly pull away. Tyler faced his own separate collapse when social media users dug up his live stream, where he mocked me, calling me a glorified secretary, and the clip resurfaced under the trending tag of military disrespect. The brand he had partnered with saw the chatter and, without dramatic announcement, reduced his visibility in an upcoming campaign. And although he did not understand the full sequence yet, he noticed his follower count dropping in the hundreds each hour, and his tone online shifted from carefree confidence to increasingly defensive content that only worsened his image. I watched all of this unfold with a detached calm, because it was not vengeance inflicted by my hand, but rather the natural unraveling of a lie that had been stretched too far and exposed under the harshness of unexpected truth. The world outside our home could see clearly what had been concealed inside it for years. The real twist arrived a week later when the Veterans Center in Charlotte, where Cheryl often bragged that the Archer family donated, posted their annual donor transparency list, including anonymous and partial donor codes, and the initials V. Archer repeated across multiple years caught the attention of a local reporter who connected it to the viral clips about Captain Sloan Archer. Since the timing of those donations aligned with my deployments within hours, it became common knowledge that the money the Archers claimed credit for came from me, not from them. And their narrative of sacrifice evaporated in public view, leaving Cheryl stunned silent because she had used that false generosity to build her personal image. Daniel attempted to defend himself by insisting to acquaintances that he had always supported me, but screenshots of his silence during the birthday humiliation circulated beside the donor list, and people drew their own conclusions. Community members who once praised Cheryl for volunteer work at church began to avoid her not out of cruelty, but because respect cannot be rebuilt on a foundation of exposed deceit. While all this happened, I performed a small, quiet action that accelerated the downward slope. I sent a simple formal email to a major contractor who frequently collaborated with my father's construction business. I did not complain or criticize. I only attached a public link to the viral clip without commentary. And because I knew the man was a retired officer, I trusted him to recognize what he was seeing and decide for himself whether he wanted professional association with a company that publicly demeaned military service. Within 72 hours, he suspended work negotiations with Daniel, stating that principles mattered more than profit. As the days unfolded, I heard through distant connections that Daniel and Cheryl were panicking. Their income had begun to shrink as clients withdrew one by one. Their reputation in church faltered because people whispered about hypocrisy, and their friends no longer invited them to gatherings after watching the clip. Yet despite the growing fear, they had still not understood the full extent of the separation I had executed over the years, because they did not know that legally and financially, I had already cut every tie that could be used to claim authority over me. My father attempted to call twice, leaving messages that wavered between confusion and irritation, saying this whole thing has been blown out of proportion and telling me that if I wanted the family to recover, I needed to issue a public statement, clarifying that the moment had been misunderstood. I listened to the message while sitting in the quiet of my barracks office and let the phone rest on my desk because there was nothing to clarify and nothing to correct, since the world had simply seen the truth they had tried to bury. Cheryl, meanwhile, tried a different tactic, posting a vague message on her social media saying families should support one another, even when mistakes are made, accompanied by a picture of a sunset that once would have played well in her circle, but now drew comments like, "You should have supported your daughter at her ceremony," or "Respect starts at home," and she deleted the post within an hour after the tone shifted against her. Watching them scramble felt surreal because for so long I had believed they held power over how the world perceived me. Yet in that moment it was clear that my worth had never depended on their approval, and the respect that followed the exposure was not something they could rewrite or reclaim. Every day the consequences tightened, as if the universe was slowly rebalancing the scales the way it always does when truth finally reaches the surface. And while Daniel and Cheryl flailed to regain control, they had not yet realized the most important fact, which was that they no longer had access to my finances, my records, my benefits, or my future, because I had severed those ties long before the world saw what they had done. Their panic was the beginning of their unraveling, but it was only the start of what they would face when desperation forced them to come back to me, seeking rescue from a collapse they had built with their own hands. A few months passed into early 2025, and the dust settled just enough for the reality of their situation to catch up to them, because the construction company that Daniel once bragged about during every family dinner was now hanging by a thread after losing the key contract that kept his cash flow alive. He had assumed for years that if anything ever went wrong, his soldier daughter would use her status to secure him a military-adjacent project, or at least vouch for him with someone who would hand him a safety net. Yet when the bank reviewed his loan renewal and saw the drop in revenue, along with the online backlash tied to his name, they requested additional guarantees, and he foolishly told them that his daughter served in special operations and could back the loan if necessary, which of course was impossible. And when the bank officers asked for documentation, he had nothing to provide. Their patience expired, and they issued a formal demand that left him pale and shaken. The first call came from Cheryl, whose voice cracked the moment I picked up, as if she wanted to sound fragile enough to trigger sympathy. She said people in the community had misunderstood the situation, that the viral clip painted them unfairly, that they had always supported me, and somehow everything online had been twisted by outsiders. She insisted I issue a statement clarifying that things were fine and that the birthday comments had been just family teasing her tone. Sharpened. When I remained quiet, she ended with a desperate, "People are turning on us and you could fix this with one post," but I simply replied, "I am busy on base," then let the silence swallow whatever she thought she was entitled to demand. A day later, Daniel texted asking to meet in person, and because I wanted clarity rather than more circular excuses, I agreed to meet him at a cafe just outside Fort Liberty, the kind of small, quiet place with neutral lighting where people usually come to sort out complicated conversations or end relationships. He sat across from me looking smaller than I remembered, shoulders slumped, fingers tapping the cup as if he needed to keep moving, so the truth would not settle all at once. He began describing the situation with his company, trying to present it as a temporary downturn caused by rumor rather than consequence, saying clients had walked away because they misunderstood his relationship with his daughter. He leaned forward and said, "If you could just speak publicly and say your family has always supported you, it would calm everything down. I want you to help us rebuild this before it is too late. And if you could introduce us to some military contractors or put in a good word, we could survive this." Hearing him talk like that without acknowledging a single moment of actual harm felt like someone had pressed rewind on my childhood and played every pattern of manipulation in one sitting. I kept my breathing steady and asked why he believed I owed him a public defense, and he hesitated before offering the line that revealed everything he truly believed. After all we have invested in you, it is your turn to help us. The sentence stung, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed the narrative that had shaped my entire life. The belief that my accomplishments were on loan to them and my existence was their asset to leverage. I let the weight settle between us. Then I spoke slowly to ensure he heard every word without distraction. I explained that military officers are prohibited from using rank or access for personal or family gain. I explained that I would never lie publicly to restore a reputation built on deception, and I explained that if they wanted respect, they had to earn it through the people they belittled, not by asking me to provide a shortcut. Daniel tried shifting the blame again, saying everything blew up because I let that team barge into the party and that I had embarrassed them in front of everyone. I felt a cold calm rise in me as I answered, "I did not humiliate you. I simply stopped covering for you." The truth walked into the room and spoke for itself. Cheryl must have been waiting nearby because she called within minutes, as if coordinating an attack from two fronts. Her tone was sharper this time, lacking the earlier softness. She accused me of turning the public against them and claimed I was being unreasonable by refusing to help the family that raised me. I listened without interruption, then repeated the same principle. I will not lie for you. I will not use my position for you, and I will not clean up a mess you created. She sputtered something about loyalty and betrayal, but her words dissolved against the steady quiet in my chest. The kind of quiet you develop only after years of being denied your voice and finally reclaiming it. After I ended the call, I took a small card from my pocket, one I had prepared long before the birthday party because some part of me anticipated this moment. I slid it across the table toward Daniel. It held 2 phone numbers, one for the Veterans Center in Charlotte and one for a financial advisor who specialized in small business recovery programs. Both organizations were built on respect for service and had strict policies against manipulation. I told him, if you want help, start with people who understand what the word service means, maybe learn it yourself. And I watched him stare at the card as if unsure whether to be offended or grateful. The mini revenge settled quietly inside me like a final stitch, closing a wound because I had not shouted or punished or sought spectacle. I had simply redirected them to the only path where accountability could exist, and removed myself as the buffer that once absorbed all their consequences. As I left the cafe, I felt no guilt, only the clarity that this was a different battlefield than the ones I briefed in uniform. This was the battlefield of boundaries and truth, and for the first time in my life, I was not fighting for their approval, but standing firmly in my own narrative and letting theirs fall apart without my support. I moved into my small lakeside house near Fayetteville in early spring, when the weather was mild enough that the air drifted through the open windows without feeling heavy, and the sunlight settled gently across the wooden floors. The place was quiet in a way I had never experienced growing up, because every corner reflected only my choices and none of the noise that used to shape my life. I furnished it simply with clean lines and neutral colors and created a wall dedicated to my medals patches and challenge coins, arranging them slowly one by one, as if giving myself permission to finally look directly at the proof of what I had done without needing anyone else to acknowledge it. And as I stepped back to take in the display, I realized I no longer felt the pull to hide my accomplishments from the people who had tried so hard to shrink me. My relationship with Daniel remained minimal low contact, as therapists call it, where I answered his occasional messages with short neutral replies without offering details about my assignments or my personal life, because he had lost the right to those things long before the birthday party fallout with Cheryl and Tyler. I maintained strict silence because contact with them felt unnecessary and even dangerous to my sense of peace. There was no anger left, just a boundary that felt natural, like a lock on a door you no longer check twice because the instinct becomes part of you. At Fort Liberty, I began mentoring younger women entering military intelligence and special operations tracks, and many of them carried the same wounds. I once hid. The stories came out during late-night debriefs or after long days in classrooms, where they quietly admitted that their families treated their service as an inconvenience or a joke. And whenever they hesitated to speak their truth, I told them about the night someone called me support staff in a room full of people, without mentioning names or details that would expose my family. I framed the story as a case study about identity erosion and internal resolve. And every time I watched their expressions shift from shame to recognition, I understood that sharing the lesson mattered more than hiding the wound. The twist arrived when the Veterans Center in Charlotte invited me to a small internal ceremony intended to honor service members who had contributed significantly to the well-being of the community. I expected nothing formal yet. When I walked in, I saw a covered frame leaning against the brick wall, and the director asked whether I would be willing to allow them to display a portrait of me in one of their halls. The image had been carefully edited to shield my face, partially due to operational security, and beneath the portrait a metal plaque read, "Valkyrie, she brought them home," followed by "Donated" by Captain Archer, and anonymous supporters with no mention of the Archer family or Daniel or Cheryl. And as I stood there, a long quiet filled me, because the recognition was entirely detached from the narrative they had built around my name for years. I agreed to let them hang the portrait, and a few weeks later, it became part of the center's permanent display. Veterans, young and old, passed it daily, unaware of the family story behind it, and for the first time, the weight of my service belonged solely to me and to the people who had lived the cost of it, not to those who had benefited from pretending they played a role in my journey. The poetic justice unfolded one afternoon when Daniel visited the center, seeking business counseling, something I learned later from the director who had not known he was my father until he saw his reaction. Apparently, he arrived holding a folder of financial records and asked for advice on rebuilding his company, and as he waited in the lobby, his eyes landed on the portrait. He stepped closer, perhaps curious, then froze, as soon as he read the name. Beneath the image, people say his face went still in a way that suggested something collapsing inward, because in that moment he understood that all the goodwill he once claimed did not come from his efforts or sacrifices, but from the daughter he and his wife had belittled for years. The room around him continued with its usual rhythm, while he stood alone absorbing the truth that the recognition displayed on the wall did not belong to him and never would. I was not there to witness it, and I am grateful for that, because the justice was not in confronting him or watching him stumble. The justice was in knowing that he had to face the truth without me softening it, without me translating it, without me absorbing the impact. For him, the way I had done throughout my childhood and early career, this time, he had to carry the weight alone. On a quiet evening weeks later, I sat on my porch watching the reflection of the setting sun ripple across the lake, while a soft breeze carried the scent of pine. From the woods nearby, my phone buzzed gently with a notification, and when I checked it, I found an email from the Pentagon, confirming that I had been selected to join a working group focused on special operations mental health and family resilience, the kind of initiative that could change the lives of soldiers who face complex pressure both in the field and at home. I leaned back in my chair, letting the calm settle through me as I realized that my path had stretched far beyond anything my younger self could have imagined. I thought about how long I had believed that being seen by my family would validate my existence, and how every achievement had once felt incomplete without their approval. But the truth now rested clearly in my mind, like a steady compass pointing forward, because the people who saluted me under fire, the people who trusted my judgment in moments that determined life or death, the people who knew me as Valkyrie had always understood my worth, and that was enough. If you have ever felt small inside your own home while carrying the weight of everyone else's world outside, leave a single dot in the comments, because someone out there may need to know they are not alone.